Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Kevin. My name is Tommy Bergstrom, and I work here at DEP for the Watershed Improvement Branch. So we'll be talking about wonderful wetlands today. So we'll do a quick warm-up and learn a little bit about wetland habitats and show you how you can classify them. We'll learn about functions and flood retention, biodiversity, location, and how they work with climate change. So just to check on everybody's mood before we get too far into the presentation, can you tell me in the chat box which wetland animal mood you are in today? It's Friday. Are you a grumpy toad like number 6? Are you a snappy turtle like number 4? A quacky duck like number 8? Or I think I'm a 7 today, maybe a happy spotted salamander because it's Friday. So I see we have one grumpy toad. And we have a beaver, yay! Awesome. Just like to check in with everybody and get a pulse before we go further. Thanks for participating. All right, so a little bit of background that is relative to the presentation is that I grew up in an area that is home to the largest wetland complex in West Virginia. Does anybody know where that is by chance? If so, you can drop it in the chat box. The area is Canaan Valley. So if that's what you were thinking, you're right. I studied biological science at Marshall University, and I had a special focus on herpetology for my thesis. So these are the different frog calls that you can see down here, and they show up on a spectrogram, and you're able to identify the animals by their calls, just like birds. And then I worked with the Division of Forestry on wildlife restoration projects. So I like to spend a lot of time outside, especially in wetlands. And nowadays I conduct workshops with educators specifically on wetlands, and any opportunity I get to talk about these cute little guys up here, I like to hop on. So to get us warmed up a little bit more, we're going to go through a few things this afternoon. The first thing is I'm going to play a short little video, and we're just going to take 15 or 20 seconds and listen. And if you can identify any of the animals, even if it's just bird or frog, I'd like for you to list it in the chat box. All right, so somebody said green frog, which is absolutely correct. Those were the little banjo ones that we were hearing, and there were several different birds calling, and I'm sure there's all kinds of life that maybe is not vocalizing, but is also in the wetland. So from this picture and from this video and from the sounds, think about how you might define what a wetland is. And this is something that you can jot down at home while we go through the presentation. But I just like to see, how do you feel about a wetland? And we can create a little list of pros and cons as we go through the presentation today. And this is part of one of our warm-up activities and our Wow, the Wonders of Wetland guide. Usually I hear a lot of cons about wetlands. A lot of people think they're muddy and they're smelly and they're buggy and they have snakes and bears and I might get my feet wet, all kinds of awful things, right? Well, sometimes these things are pretty cool if we know a little bit more about them. So oftentimes by the end of a workshop, some of our things on our con list might pop over to our pro list. We're going to do an activity real quick called Wetland Metaphors. So I'm going to be pulling an item out of this bag, and then we'll decide how that object can represent what a wetland is or does. And you can put your answer in the chat box. So I pulled out a cradle. how do you think a cradle represents what a wetland is or does? Anybody have any guesses? How is a cradle a metaphor for a wetland? Okay, of raising young, birthplace, so much life. Very good. Yes, so a wetland provides a nursery that shelters, protects, and feeds young wildlife, much like a cradle represents a nursery. Nice work. We'll do one more. The object I pulled out is a strainer. So how does a strainer represent what a wetland is or does? How is a strainer a wetland metaphor? Okay, we have absorbs bad stuff. Yes, right on track. So a wetland strains silt and debris from water. So it's nature's way of keeping our water supply clean. So if we go back to our pros and cons list, we can now add on 2 different things to our pros list. Wetlands are like nurseries for wildlife, and they strain silt and debris from our water. And like I said, feel free to jot down more notes as we go on today. So what is a wetland? A wetland is wet land, made both of water and land. Wetlands may support both aquatic and terrestrial species. Aquatic meaning our water-loving ones, like our frog down here, and terrestrial meaning like our fox up here, land species. This is a little diagram that shows different types of wetland habitats. So you might notice down here, where we're actually down in the water, we call these types of wetlands marshes. And this is where they have emergent or dense emergent type of plants. Once we get up into the grassy area, that's usually called a meadow, which is also a type of marsh. And then as we get into larger type of plant life, like trees and shrubs, we call this area a swamp. And then there's even more wetlands upland of that. So from looking at this image, I have a big question for you. Are wetlands always wet? This is my trick question for the day. Grumpy Cat says, nope. Right, apparently they are not. So let's look at that a little bit closer. Wetlands are areas where the land is covered by shallow water or the soil is saturated to the surface for at least 2 weeks during the growing season. So wetlands do need to have water and land, but they do not have to have water at the surface all the time, although many of them do. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a definition for a wetland. They say it has to have these 3 things. First, it has to have hydrophytic plants, meaning water-tolerant plants. Second, it has to have hydric soils, meaning the soils should be saturated with water. And 3, it has to have wetland hydrology, meaning it's pretty close to the water table and it has a presence of water. Now, some other places, such as the Fish and Wildlife Service, say that you just need to have 2 of 3 of these, not all 3. So there's a little bit of debate there, but it's basically the plants, the soil, and the water. That's how we defined wetlands. So let's take a look at some different habitats. Each type has different kinds of water. So when I say that, think about saltwater or freshwater or mixed, or where the water might come from. Is it from a lake, from a river or ocean, or even from groundwater? And then think about the soils and the plants. So let's go through a little activity so that we can learn how to sort common types of wetlands. So in this photo right here with 9 different pictures, we can see that there's a lot of variance in between these wetlands. You might notice that some of them have a lot of water present in them. You might notice that there's different vegetation in them. And some of them you can see soil and other ones you can't. So we're going to go through just 2 different cards here to figure out what wetland habitat they are. And this is again from our Wow's the Wonder of Wetland book. This is our flow chart that we're going to use. It's very simple. And I'll show you the first card and then we'll get started on it. Feel free to read along with me at home if you would like. Old lake beds and other low areas that fill with rainwater sometimes accumulate layers of partially decaying plants called peat. At first glance, these places might look dry, but their moss-covered floors actually hold a good deal of fresh water just below the surface. The ground here feels very spongy. Some shrubs and evergreen trees also grow above the sphagnum moss. In these unusual conditions, many unique, beautiful, and rare plants and animals can be found. So I'm going to slide this card over to the side. We're going to pull up our flow chart and we're going to start right here. So first we need to talk about the water. Is the land sometimes covered with water or is it always covered with water? And if you want to go along with me, you can feel free to drop things in the chat box. So the land is sometimes covered with water. On to our next question. The water is tidal, the land is uncovered when tide is low, or the water is not tidal. Surface water dries up part of the year, water present below surface of the ground. So we know with this one, the water is not tidal. So we've characterized the water. Now we're going to move on to the plant life. So our options are it has mostly trees, shrubs, it's a low spot in the field or meadow, or it's very spongy floor covered with sphagnum moss. The sphagnum moss one, right? And so that leads us over to a bog. So this wetland habitat would be classified as a bog. Okay, and we'll just go through one more, just to give one more example. And both of these wetland habitats, by the way, we have here in West Virginia. Scrubby, low-growing thickets of shrubs grow here in places that you might have started out as wet meadows. You might find these places near the coast or where lakes, streams, rivers, marshes, and forested swamps overflow. They're not always covered with water. This type of wetland offers good habitat for fish, reptiles, amphibians, and many other animals. Okay, so again, I'm going to slide that card over and we'll pull up our flow chart. We're going to start with the same question. The land is sometimes covered with water or always covered with water. We have sometimes. The water is tidal or not tidal. And we have water is not tidal. So again, now we're going to look at our plant life. And we know from this one that it has mostly shrubs, right? So that leads us over to Shrub Swamp. Now, some of these other ones, we would have to get more in the nitty gritty and look at the soil to figure out which type of wetland habitat it is. So I hope you found that helpful to help understand how to characterize different types of wetlands. Whenever you are out, or if you just see photos of wetlands, think about the water, what type of water it is and where it comes from, the soil, and the plants that are present, and that will help you be able to characterize the wetland. And wetlands have many, many, many names. There are marshes, which are always waterlogged, and there's these really cool things called prairie potholes that we see in North Dakota and South Dakota. They're really important for migratory birds. Another type of marsh is also called a wet meadow. We have these really cool things called mangroves that maybe you've seen before. We have those in the United States, down in Florida and on our southern coast. And these have brackish water in them, so they're not just fresh water, they're a mixture. There are estuaries, and this is where our rivers meet the sea, as you can see out here. Even a mudflat is considered a type of wetland. And deltas are also very important wetlands. In West Virginia, we have a lot of ponds, which are a type of wetland too. There are fens, which are solely groundwater fed. They may receive a little bit of rain from the sky, but most of their water comes from underneath them. In West Virginia, we have many of these swamps, which are vegetated by trees and shrubs. We also have sloughs, which are the backwater of a river system. And we have bogs like the cranberry glades. These have no inlet or outlet, meaning there's not an obvious stream flowing into it or out of it. There are also things called meres, which are peatlands, and these are really slow to process. So if I dropped a nail in there or a screwdriver or something like that, you'll probably go back several hundred years later and it would be in mint condition. And then a really neat one that's down in Texas, these wetlands are called playas or dry lakes. And they are also very, very important for migratory birds. And of course, there are our bottomland floodplain areas along streams. And since we have so many rivers and streams in West Virginia, we have a lot of these types of wetlands. So why are wetlands important? Why am I doing a whole talk about them with you today? Essentially, wetlands are the kidneys of the landscape. So as you may know, humans do not do very well without their kidneys, right? And the earth does not do very well without wetlands. We need those for many, many different things, but essentially we need them to filter out a lot of stuff that gets into our waterways. And they even host a bacteria that helps the conversion of nitrates to nitrogen. Wetlands protect shorelines and banks from erosion. So anytime that we can have vegetation along our streams, it helps reduce erosion by holding that soil in place, but also by gently slowing that water down so that soil can fall out of the water column and help build up stream banks. Wetlands also store carbon and moderate global climate conditions. This is really important. So we always think of big forests as really good at holding in carbon, but wetlands do a much better job even than forests. They also provide recreation and an outside classroom for education. And I believe you all had a talk about the cranberry glades maybe a month ago, maybe a little bit longer, I'm not sure. But this is a boardwalk from the cranberry. And you can see there's so much to learn. A lot of people go to wetlands just to sit down and photograph because there's so many different animals and plants there that you can find in one condensed area. Wetlands also preserve cultural heritage and archaeological evidence. So this one photo that I have here is from Florida. And this is just a diagram depicting what happened. But there was an area in Florida that was drained for a housing development, and it revealed a 7,000-year-old burial ground for Native Americans. So some of these wetlands, they can preserve things for a very, very long time. And sorry, I moved. There we go. Wetlands also provide fuel, timber, and food. And we always think, yeah, it provides food, timber, and fuel for us, for humans, but it also does that for many other animals. Wetlands also help to stabilize water supplies and reduce flooding. This is a critically important thing that they do. It's a very major function of a wetland. They also provide flood damage by absorbing flood water like a sponge. So a lot of people will compare wetlands to sponges. So if you take a sponge at home and you stick it down in a bucket of water, see how much it can hold, pull it out and then squeeze it, you can see how much water can be held by that sponge. They are also like a bathtub. So they will hold water for a long period of time and then slowly start to release it back into our groundwater system, which is really important for hydrology. They also allow vegetation to slow down water so that it can be absorbed and stabilize soil with their roots. So this picture here that I have at the bottom of this slide, if you look on the left-hand side, this has all been, commercialized. It has residential areas there. And on the other side of the highway, it's all wetlands. So if we had a flood event happen, what side do you think would fare better? Everything on the right-hand side there is going to be able to buffer and hold that flood water much better than on the left-hand side, which is going to cause more flooding downstream because of all the impervious surfaces. So that's a lot of information, but this little infograph shows pretty much everything I just talked about. So whenever it rains, if there's a wetland nearby, some of that water is going to go down into the soil. Some of it's going to run off like it naturally would. If there's a wetland nearby, that can get charged up. It can also hold that water. So maybe this was kind of shallow because it was a dry season, and then we got a really big rain event, and the water can just be held in this area here. And then it can slowly release back into our stream whenever we have a dry event again. That's how our ground table works, which is really neat. If you've ever heard of a rainforest before, or if you've ever heard of a coral reef, wetlands are right up there with them. They are biological super systems. So all three of these ecosystems are critically important for planet Earth. Wetlands also have a lot of biodiversity. So in West Virginia, we could expect to pretty much see all of these animals here. Many different types of birds are in a wetland, many different types of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and even macroinvertebrates are little stream bugs. So we'll see all these animals, but in addition to that, there's all kinds of different plants that live just in wetlands too. That's why there's such a great area to go check out. For others, they are a critical food source. They provide shelter and breeding ground to ensure species survival. And in West Virginia, we have over 150 rare and endangered plants that depend on wetlands for survival. And many of the plants and animals are especially adapted to live in wetlands. And if we have time at the end here, I have a short video of one that I just learned about that I'll show you too. But this is just a cattail. So if you take a cross section of a cattail, you can see all these little air sacs inside of it. So that's a really neat adaptation. Essentially, every part of a cattail has been adapted to live in a wetland. So if you get some time to check those out, they're really neat plants, but there's so many others too. So if you're at a wetland, you can download a book that we have on our website, and I'll share that with Kevin, but you can identify most of our common wetland plants. And back to wildlife, they provide food source, shelter, and breeding grounds like we said. So we can see up here, there's a beaver that's making a little home out of this dam. We have a heron here that's getting ready to get some food. And then we have a bunch of different American toads that are hoping to breed that night. So wow, wetlands are wonderful. This is what I'm hoping that you're saying in your head right now. Where can I find one? Well, let me tell you. Wetland locations. Wetlands cover only 6.4% of the Earth's surface, which is not very much, right? But they account for 24% of total global productivity, which is almost a quarter of that. That means there's a lot going on in wetlands, whether it's below the water, below the surface, over in the plants, or actually in the plants. Wetlands exist in every country and in every climate zone, which is pretty unique. So they range from the polar regions all the way to the tropics. In Canada, we have 15% of the world's wetland acreage. That's pretty impressive. And this area includes summer habitat for the last remaining flock of wild whooping cranes. So you can see those animals pictured here. It is estimated that there are only 85 of these animals left. 14 of them are which are wild hatched and the rest are captive reared. So this habitat, this wetland habitat in Canada, it is really large, but there's a lot of animals that really depend on it. So it has to be managed properly. If we look at West Virginia, about 30% of all of our state's wetlands are found in Greenbrier and Tucker counties, as you can see here on the map. And I know this is not very big, but I didn't want to get too much in the details, but down here is Greenbrier County, and up here is Tucker. So you can see we have a lot of green in those areas. And then as far as what types of wetlands we have, I mentioned that we have ponds, so we do, but we also have a lot of forested wetlands, of course, and emergent. And that's where they come out of the water and onto the land. That's the emergent area, usually where there's water around year round. And we have a lot of them next to our rivers. We have so many in our state. Wetlands have been dredged, filled, drained, polluted, and degraded. We've not been very kind to them, maybe because we did not fully understand them, maybe because they're a little buggy, little smelly sometimes, and our shoes get stuck in them when we walk through. Less than half of the nation's wetlands remain. But nowadays, wetlands are protected by the Federal Clean Water Act. Thank goodness for the Clean Water Act. So what if I told you we could save wetlands? Let's look at this little infographic. If we had a river system going down, whenever it rains, or we have a major water event, wetlands allow for areas for that water to overflow into. When it overflows into these areas, or if it comes down the hill into these areas, again, wetlands will kind of hold that water, allow it to slowly recharge back into the groundwater system and soak up, just like a big sponge would. Oftentimes, what we have done is we've eliminated those wetlands because they're next to a river, and we would like to farm next to a river, or we'd like to have buildings or houses next to rivers. Because of that now, we've had to engineer how to control a river, which is a difficult thing to do. Water does not like to be controlled. Flood peaks may increase by as much as 80% if you don't have a wetland nearby, or if you have removed a wetland that was there in the first place. So we know that one of the major results of climate change that we're starting to face is flooding events, especially here in West Virginia. So the more wetlands that we have along our rivers, around our lakes, the less flooding that we are going to have, and the cleaner water we're going to have. And I think we have time. I'm just going to show you about a minute of this video, because this is another creature that I just learned about that I think is so neat.
Deep in the swamps of Missouri, the mud and moisture combine to create an ideal habitat for stranger things. This is a place where the swamp creatures are so secretive, they rarely get a glimpse even of each other. In this bizarre environment, it's surprising to find rabbits. But these aren't any old bunnies. These are swamp rabbits, a unique species that is the largest cottontail on the planet. And these animals have an incredible superpower. Their size gives them increased buoyancy and musculature to be great swimmers. They're so comfortable in the water that they easily move about floodplains and swamps to evade predators, find food, and mates.
All right, I'll go ahead and stop it there since I think we're at our time. But swamp rabbits. So rabbits have even adapted to live in wetlands, which is really cool. So I thought I would share that as an exiting note. Thank you all so much for your time today. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email them to me, or you can drop them into the chat box there.
Tommy, thank you so much. And I'm going to ask a few questions. If you see any in the chat, please feel free to answer those. I'm desperate to ask a question.
Okay, if I can answer it okay for you.
You mentioned bottomlands, and I mean, in my experience, of course, there's bottomlands all over West Virginia that can flood, and we've had a really dry year actually in our corner of West Virginia here. And I didn't see what I normally see, which is the little crayfish coming up out of and creating these little holes all over in the bottom at our place. And I don't know if that's something that I've always wondered how common those crayfish are in other wetlands, or they really focus on those sorts of bottomlands. Do you know more about that?
I'm not the expert to talk about that for sure, but I know that there's so many different types of crayfish. I assume that there's ones that specialize, to your area. I'm assuming you're talking along the Greenbrier River.
Along a tributary, along Wolf Creek. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll duck out of that question so I don't give you wrong information.
That's okay. I didn't know. I have another question, which is, so one thing that I found interesting in thinking about wetlands, you had said about for fuel for humans and for other creatures. And I think of wetlands. Wetlands used to be so widespread more than today in West Virginia, and how that really sort of created the conditions for our fossil fuel economy here in West Virginia. And I don't know if that's an inaccurate, is that accurate, Tommy, that that association?
I mean, I'm sure that they're tied in a little bit. I think most of our wetlands were removed mainly for farming initially. But along our major river systems, most of that has been developed because it's nice to transport things down our river systems. So depending on what it is that you might be transporting. But I think historically, a lot of them were just simply drained for farmland, especially in the Eastern Panhandle area, because we have really nice soil, in a lot of those spaces. Does that answer your question okay, or would you like me to dive in a little bit deeper?
No, it does. I was also thinking about the swamps that, of course, where the plants rotted and then were compressed as to form coal and gas.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, we've had a lot of that happening for a long time. That's why we have so much coal in the area, right? Of course, I should have mentioned that coal is formed from our wetlands and from all the decaying matter from years and years and years.
Can I throw another question at you?
Sure.
I wrote down that wetlands do better than forests, and I might have the words wrong, at capturing carbon and moderating climate change, something like that you had said. And I just was curious how they do.
Yes, I might need to go back a slide to my notes there, but there was a study recently done. By recent, I think it was 2008. And I think it was wetlands held up to 78% more carbon. So we kind of call these things carbon sinks. And so wetlands do a much better job. Not that forests aren't incredible too, but they do a much better job of holding carbon. Now, whenever we remove a wetland, that of course gets released. So that's another thing to consider of why we would want to keep the ones that we have here.
Mm. That's fascinating. I didn't realize it was so much more.
Me neither. Yeah, Elizabeth Byers provided that slide for me, and it had that site on there. So if I can look it up and send it to you if you'd like to read up on it more.
Sure, we can pass that along too.
Be happy to.
I also had, this is my last question, I'm hogging all the questions, is I'm always fascinated to come upon a high elevation wetland, or I didn't, in that chart that you showed, I had thought of them as vernal pools, but maybe some of the ones that I've just seen one time, they could be a wet meadow that stays wet. I'm not sure. And I guess I was curious if you could say a thing about the difference between maybe those, like a vernal pool versus something is maybe a high elevation wet meadow or some other kind of wetland.
Yeah. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm the right person to speak on that, because vernal pools can kind of pop up anywhere. And I think that they would pop up within a wetland classification already. So there might be a wet meadow, and within the wet meadow, there might be a vernal pool that is there, for a few months out of the year or a month out of the year. And there might be a forested wetland or a shrub wetland where there's a vernal pool present for, a month or two. So I think they're kind of a habitat within a habitat, if you will. Yeah.
That makes sense. Your diagram that showed me it made me think that there's probably a lot more of those just kind of squishy places or kind of damp soil places that are actually wetlands to start, and not just when I can see the surface of the water, even if it's just part of the year. That was really interesting.
Yeah, because it just has to have soil, or excuse me, water present at the surface for 2 weeks, which is not very long. And so we're actually working to map our wetlands in West Virginia a little bit more. And we have a nice EPA grant that we are working towards the next 3 years to do some of that. But yeah, there's wetlands just all over the state, I think in little pockets. A lot of them are disconnected. And maybe a lot of them, people don't recognize them as a wetland because they don't have cattails, and an open surface water like we might associate with a wetland. So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about the different types, because there are so many different types. I mean, every time I look at it, it just blows my mind. I'm like, it's a rabbit hole you can go down through. I'm learning all the different ones, which is really neat. I love the diversity of wetlands because each of those different habitats attract different animals and plants. It's pretty cool stuff to get into.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. It was first time I'd ever seen that map of where all the wetlands are in the state, and the fact that there's so many in Greenbrier County relative to other counties was interesting to me. I know where those wetlands are, but I guess I don't know how publicly accessible they are, and but they are really important. You can see them off 64.
Yeah, the Meadow River complex is that main one in Greenbrier County, and it is our second largest wetland complex in the state, the first one being the Canaan Valley area. And another thing with this grant that we're hoping to accomplish is providing a little bit more access, or at least information about the Meadow River complex. DNR, I don't want to throw them out there yet and say it for certain, but I believe that they are trying to create access. And when I say create access, I don't mean put a road through the wetland, but create a boardwalk so that people can safely access that wetland without damaging it or impacting it.